Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Driving M&A Success, Insights for Corporate Development Executives. Today, we're joined by two esteemed M&A experts from E78 Partners, Scott Whitaker and Stefan Hofmeyer. Together, they bring decades of experience in M&A integration, strategy, and execution. Scott Whitaker is the Managing Director of Transaction Advisory at E78 Partners and is a globally recognized M&A expert. Scott has advised and managed hundreds of M&A projects and is also the author of multiple books on M&A integration. Joining him is Stefan Hofmeyer, Executive Vice President at E78 Partners. Stefan is an expert in integration delivery and resource management, leading the development of repeatable solutions for in-house M&A integration and carve-out strategies. Together, Scott and Stefan have led over 450 engagements globally across all industries. Go ahead, Stefan. Thank you. At E78, we focus on three key areas, but today we're going to dive into transaction advisory and M&A integration. Before we dive in, though, let's go over today's session objectives. Our goal is to enhance your understanding of post-merger integration, considerations, and best practices. We'll cover the key topics listed here. Now, a quick note on logistics. The session is going to run for approximately 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A segment. So we encourage you to use the Q&A function at any time to submit your questions or comments. While we'll address them at the end, feel free to send them in as they come up. And a survey will be shared at the end of the session. We'd love to hear your feedback. Also, the webinar is being recorded and will be shared with all attendees afterwards. So with that being said, let's just dive into today's discussion. Scott and Stefan, over to you guys.
Great. Thank you very much, Grace. So to get the webinar started here, I wanted to talk a little bit about our annual M&A Success Survey. This is driven by Global PMI Partners and supported by Oxford Said Business School, Sterling Technology, and of course ourselves here at E78. And what we did primarily over the last summer and then fall of last year, created a survey of 115 respondents. And those respondents were either in senior executive leadership roles, deal-making roles, or as senior leaders with M&A integration. And of those 115, which was a globally sourced base of respondents, approximately 70% of those that were responding were in mid-market or Fortune 500 companies. So we had a good representation across the board, but we had a significant number of larger company respondents that participated. And this survey will be out in the next few weeks, and we'll be providing you that link as well for those who attended the survey or this webinar. But for now, we'll go through some of the highlights that will set us up and allow Scott to talk a little bit about why some of these areas are important to you in the corporate development space. So as we talk about pre-deal and integration planning best practices, obviously the top areas for diligence are covered, which of course is finance, HR, and legal. But what we found over the past year is that two areas crept up significantly, and that was IT and operations diligence work, and that overtook commercial go-to-market diligence, although that is still important as well. But we've seen, in the survey, but also in our own practice, that a lot more folks are completing diligence in IT and operations as part of their diligence effort. One of the more surprising factors that we took a look at is that 60% of respondents still operate without a structured M&A playbook. That's for the deal side of the efforts for the playbook there, as well as for M&A integration, which was really surprising to me, especially given that 70% were looking at more larger deals in the mid-market to Fortune 500 space. And so that, as a practitioner of, decades of experience, was surprising. And that may have resulted in the integration complexity drivers, where a lot of the deal integration work lasted over 7 months in length. And 27% actually exceeded 12 months in length for completing integration efforts. And as you may know, and what's really important, and Scott will go into it in a little bit, it's really important to get the integration work done very quickly and move ahead in an operational framework where you can start achieving synergies and getting people back to their day jobs. And so what we have found over the years, of course, is establishing an M&A playbook is extremely important for that to occur. So moving on here with the survey, just a quick summary. Increased market share, enhanced value proposition, and expanding product service offerings were the key top deal rationales that we had found in our survey. And of course, the enhancing value proposition and expanding service offerings is a bit correlated, but that's what we saw in the marketplace. And what was really interesting to me is in general, what we saw, and it's not listed here, but what we saw about 70% of practitioners tracked deal metrics, validated and tracked deal metrics and synergies. What we had found in the survey, though, is for survey participants that did track and validate synergies, that 92% were successful versus the folks that did not track and manage the surveys, they were less successful. That makes, of course, some sense that the folks that are more diligent in the process and follow through from defining what the deal metrics are, what your deal thesis is, what your synergies are, and tracking that through to the end of a deal, making sure that those are accomplished, actually will create a successful engagement, either very successful or successful in the cases that we found in the survey. And then lastly, integration complexity drivers. The top three there were cross-border scopes of effort, cultural alignment or misalignment in many cases when you're acquiring a company in a different country, and then also multiple business line operations. And so those are the key takeaways for the survey at a high level. Grace, do you have any questions coming in about this?
Yes, there's actually one here. Any changes from prior year's results of note?
Yeah, the one thing that jumped out at me, and I would like to juxtapose when we took the survey summer and fall of last year to the first quarter of this year with some new data that the Wall Street Journal came out and produced this week in an article. So what we found is that the increase of single country acquisitions actually increased during the end of last year from 35% to 40% based on our respondents. However, obviously a lot has changed since December of last year into January. And this quarter, I was intrigued to take a look at the Wall Street Journal article that had mentioned that actually M&A activity the first quarter has gone down in the US by 14%, up in Europe by 12%, and way up in Asia Pacific by 59%. And what they had found in the Q1 year over year, which is slightly different than what we found, is that 26% last year was cross-border. This year, it's 31%. So it looks like more M&A deal making is happening outside the U.S. And of that, since primarily countries are smaller, there's more cross-border deal making, which makes things more complex and something to consider when you're doing a deal. So I thought that was interesting. Both our changed year over year, fall to fall, versus Wall Street Journal quarter to quarter from last year to this year. Anything else, Grace?
Not at this time.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And so now taking a look at the baseline of what we found in our survey, Scott Whitaker will go over some areas that are key M&A planning considerations for a deal that you may see upcoming. So Scott, I'll let you take it from here.
Thanks, Stefan. You can advance. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Nice to have you here today. One of the things we wanted to talk about is kind of aligning the corp dev process and integration. You know, a lot of the times we're working with maybe somebody in corp dev that's shepherding the deal through and then also involved in the integration, or maybe kind of overseeing a team or somebody that's involved in integration. And we're kind of talking about that type of role here. You know, unless it's really large companies, we don't see, you know, a kind of Chinese wall. There's usually some continuity, which we think is good, obviously. So, you know, that's the kind of perspective that we're looking through based on our experience. Go ahead, Stefan. So one of the things that we found is early on is figuring out what is kind of transformative in M&A. And, you know, this obviously can be somewhat, you know, vary by platform or sector, or where where you are in your growth journey. But in general, you know, the requirements for PMI capabilities and kind of org readiness is much different than a bolt-on or an acqui-hire versus a larger transformative deal. So one of the things we always recommend is, if you've been doing your own PMI work internally, which is fine, assess that. Is it scalable? Do you have, bandwidth for the folks that are going to be taking this on? Bolt-ons and acqui-hires, you can kind of bootstrap and get those done. A lot of times you don't even need third-party help. It's when you start kind of inching up in terms of complexity where you really got to assess that before you get into it. In our opinion, transformative M&A requires, the platform or the company to scale and tackle more strategic work stream and heavier lifts. And things that are going to involve more people, take more time, involve more cross-functional coordination, more coordination with the target. I mean, it all gets more complicated when you're doing more transformation kind of M&A versus some of the easier stuff. Really important to probe for weak spots, systems, people, process maturity that will strain under transformative M&A. You don't want to find that stuff out in the middle. That's things that you can fix, and it doesn't mean you have to fix it and then do, your integration work. You could address it, kind of during, but you don't want to ignore it and then wait till, kind of overwhelms that capability, and your integration is delayed or your value creation plan is delayed. And the bottom line here is, what works for bolt-ons and some of the simple stuff won't work for bigger deals. You have to scale that up to really deliver the deal thesis. Grace, is there any questions before I know I don't see them come up here, but wanted to ask while we're in progress here.
Yes, what factors determine whether a deal is transformative?
Yeah, that's a good question. In our world, anything, major newco kind of come together org design where you're kind of relaying out or have significant changes in how you're organized, anything with significant geographic expansions, especially cross-border. I don't care if you're picking up a small operation in another country, that requires more work, especially with communications. And so I would put that in the category. Anything with systems and infrastructure consolidation, data hygiene and migrations can be a heavy lift. Anything with a workforce reduction that's material, requires a lot of planning and some calm culture and change considerations, of course. And then, I think the biggest ones are when you have major go-to-market, product, and those types of things that are being, kind of recast with the combined capabilities of the company, where it's just not you're kind of bolting in a product line into an existing chassis, but kind of remaking everything, remaking how you go to market, what your proposition is, maybe branding is changing, all that stuff or some combination of it really is what we consider transformative.
What about consolidation plays versus transformative plays?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, anytime, if you've acquired 3 or 4 platforms, let's take a PE example, left them alone, and then you're consolidating, I would definitely put that in the transformation category for sure. All right, understanding and driving the value creation levers. In our process, we start with, looking at the SIM, deal decks, whatever has been memorialized to kind of codify and justify the deal. And that's where we start. We parse those growth and cost levers that support the deal thesis and turn those into integration planning briefs. So we're very specific on what needs to, happen to deliver that deal thesis, kind of separating the financial justification, why the deal makes sense, why the math works from, hey, these are the integration things that need to get done to bring that deal thesis to life. So, that's our very first deliverable. The other things that we've started to learn to do is, leverage AI. And Stefan can talk about a little bit how we're doing that early in our planning process.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. One of the things that we have found over the last couple of years, when we get into a deal to support clients, is that they sometimes don't have a very well articulated deal thesis that can be brought to an integration team for integration planning. And so one of the first things we do, for instance, is deal drivers and objectives. And so a tool we use called Cassidy, an AI tool, where we can upload proprietary data in that, as well as connect that with publicly found data, as well as potentially meeting notes. We'll take that information to establish deal drivers and objectives. And in some cases, we'll present that to the client. Again, this is not an end result, but just an input to the client. And in many cases, let's say, "Oh, this is great. This is exactly what we're trying to articulate. We haven't yet." And so, taking that information, being able to use that with AI has been a big expediter to avoid multiple meetings and really streamlining the process. And of course, we also use that same tool, Cassidy, later on in the deal process as well, assuming the clients would like to engage AI for the effort. It saves a lot of time and money.
Thanks. Also, confirming people, process, and technology enablers. Great example, something we're working on right now is just process optimization. So, three businesses coming together, looking, identifying the top 10 processes that really drive the business, looking at what the three do, what's the best to support kind of the consolidated platform, and then what's the optimization and enhancements you need to make for that kind of future state process. That's an enabler. You don't want folks kind of, trying to do things the old way when there's a new way that may be more efficient, that needs less people, that gets things done quicker. And that's an enabler. In general, you need to identify opportunities where the platform or the base business needs to scale up in order to handle the increased requirements of the combined or consolidated business. And all those things kind of are enablers to get to that deal thesis and future state. Then you have to quantify, specify those things down to the functional work plan levels. What are the KPIs you're tracking? How are you doing that? Who's tracking it? How often are you updating? Some things require a baseline, which often can be a negotiation. But when you get down to the brass tacks on the reporting and KPIs you're going to track, that's going to give you a good indication if you're moving the needle. And then you got to execute, and the value is captured during the execution. Integration delays inherently delay value creation and your ability to harvest value on time. So keeping the pace with integration, getting all this stuff done that we're talking about in the right order, by the deadlines you've established is a huge predictor of integration success. And then, if you're going to be in the business of acquiring companies, how do you make M&A planning and execution a core competency? The playbook, Stefan mentioned from the survey, seldom used, but very helpful. Obviously, companies like us help other companies build playbooks, but it can just make you do it better and faster, and you don't have to spend an arm and a leg to get one, but it just helps the team that is going to be saddled with doing integration work and their day job, which is most of us do it better. Do you have PMI leaders that you're developing internally with these skills that can kind of mother acquisitions as they come through and be the owner of that and have the skills and maybe trusted advisors or resources that can support them? That's important. Also, are you investing in some kind of tool for integration management? We have some that we recommend. We have one that we use that for most of our engagements, a simple Smartsheet platform that we've configured and customized, very inexpensive. But you need something. You can't run these things off of Excel, or some of the lighter project management tools are sometimes a little bit difficult for the rigors of true integration management. But bottom line, success depends on repeatable discipline. If you have the tool, you know how to use it. You're kind of repeating when you're doing acquisition A, then B, then C. Makes it much more easier. You're not improvising or recreating the wheel every time, adding cycles in time, that you should be taking out when you're doing, integration B, C, and D.
Scott, do you have a go-to PM tool you recommend?
Yeah, I kind of jumped the gun on that. So we use a tool called Smartsheet, which everyone's heard of, most people use. Um, and we've just configured it for integration work and built a back-end reporting platform that's automated. It's inexpensive. It's easy to adopt and put into your environment. And we specifically chose it because it requires almost zero time to learn. If you can do basic rudimentary Excel, and we do a lot of the work anyway, which is another thing we liked about it. We don't want, you don't want people having to learn a new tool when you're trying to do an integration.
Yep.
You'll frustrate people right off the bat. And plus, dedicated integration tools sometimes cover the ones that cover the full M&A life cycle. You may be using one half of it. You're using the integration half. You're not using the corp dev half. That's a different process. So you're really overpaying for it. So our approach to all integration work is very pragmatic, including our use of tools. Okay.
All right.
So I'm going to run through some best practices, and I'm not going to hit all these bullets here. And as Grace mentioned, you guys are going to get this information after the webinar concludes. But this is a roll-up of what we've seen over and over again in some key phases. Mobilization, which we define as ramping up the integration management office, and then we have one for planning and execution that I'll get to. But what we found is some things here that we've laid out: best practices, speed bumps, things that come up inevitably that you'll have to manage, key deliverables you want to make sure get done, and then leadership plus and minus. This is where people that are in C-suite management, maybe platform sponsors, can kind of add or take away in the process that we've seen. So really quickly on mobilization, getting started 30 days ahead of close, it doesn't sound like a lot. It's enough for us to do our process, but you'd be amazed how many people wait because the deal is sucking so much energy. You finally get an LOI. Everyone's anxious to close because they've been toiling with this. And then you find yourself, we're trying to do this all in 2 weeks, and we haven't even thought about day one and mandatories and mobilizing the integration management office and all that. And that takes time. And you want to add time and have at least 30 days because you don't want to compress schedules and make it a fire drill so close to something that important. So you have to put some time into the process so your cycles can accommodate the day-to-day business. So that's really important. Some speed bumps, early lack of alignment on level of integration. Some folks are saying, hey, we're not going to do much for the first 6 months, and then after that, we'll do this, or we're not going to touch it for 12 months because of an earnout, and so stay away from this. Whatever. It's key, and we always push to get alignment on what is it full, is it partial? If it's partial, what are we what half are we doing trying to get done in the first 90 or 20 days or 3-4 months? What are we truly holding out? And I can tell you a lot of times folks that are try to hold something out end up bringing it back in, and then when you're doing it that way, it's less efficient. So it's good to get aligned on that early. In terms of key deliverables, protocols established, you're usually at this stage dealing with, kind of a need to know set of people. And, if your transaction is going through HSR review, that's a whole different story. So you got to get that right so you don't create an unwanted problem for you. You're putting out fires on communications because something's leaked out to customers or part of the employee base. And so getting that, tamped down right away is important. And then, for leadership, just understanding and reinforcing the IMO process, trusting the process. Integration is a process. It involves, doing things in a particular order, tools, templates, a lot of stuff that has to get done and prepared, to set yourself up for success. And it is a process. Sometimes we're dealing with companies that may not, process may be a bit second nature or third nature. and you're laying in something that's more disciplined than how they run their day-to-day business. And that's some change. But what really helps us is when senior leadership says, "Hey guys, these folks know what they're doing. Trust the process. They're going to explain what you have to do in what order, what we're going to get done by when, and why it's important to do that." And then just keep that trust throughout the process.
Quick
Next.
question here, Scott.
Yeah.
In past years, we've seen PE deals struck with pretty aggressive, naive timelines for realizing synergy revenues from integration efforts. Are you seeing investors, PE leaders becoming more realistic as they set expectations for ROI in the deal thesis? And how could AI modeling help?
You broke up in the front part of that. Can you read that again?
Sure. Are you seeing investors, PE leaders becoming more realistic as they set expectations for ROI in the deal thesis?
Yeah, I tell you, well, we could spend some time on this one. I think, for a while there weren't real, meaningful material synergies outlined up front, especially cost savings. Coming out of COVID, people were just happy to have folks. They weren't going anywhere. There were other factors, but so that seemed to be less of a priority. I see that coming back now, where there is definitely a little bit of cost takeout baked into the deal thesis. Definitely the usual kind of, cross-selling and other kind of revenue upside synergies. What I've seen, to answer the question, is maybe a little bit more reality on how long it takes to realize those, instead of things kind of, happening right away. Understanding that, material reductions in force take time. If you're doing something overseas, especially, it is a process. Activating cross-selling synergies involves training, compensation, material development, and other things that take time. That's not going to happen in the first month after close. So I just think some trial and error and probably some disappointing results have added some reality into the time frame for that, for sponsors and acquisition leaders.
We have one more here. Are there typical missing diligence questions or areas that are critical to integration success and or value assessment?
Missing?
Yes.
I think while the diligence, that's a great question. Well, while the diligence is all focused on the stuff that Stefan kind of ticked off, one of the things that we don't see is if somebody has been, acquiring and they've done some integration work, what's the level of integration debt? What is the unfinished work? They acquired, 3 companies over 3 years, sounds great. But when you peel the onion there, you see a lot of things that are kind of on legacy X, Y, and Z, that really, if you were doing it right, you would have plans to get those consolidated. So I think a miss on diligence is integration debt.
And Grace, this is Stefan here. That first question had a little bit about AI, so I'd address that just really briefly, in the sense that, when you're looking at synergies and incorporating AI to assess that, arguably AI is also biased. But what's interesting about it is, by using AI to assess materials, it takes it away from the individual deal makers or the M&A integration practitioners a little bit, for it to get a sense of less bias and also a greater sense of organization. That's one thing AI does very well. In many cases, it does a lot of generic stuff that needs to be checked. But what it does do very well is organization, and driving clarity as to what are the synergies, what are the risks of the synergies, and how those integration plans can be implemented to achieve synergies. And so those are some areas that AI can be useful.
All right, next, Grace.
No other questions at this time.
What's that?
No other questions at this time.
Okay. Let's talk about planning, integration planning. So we define this as that sliver of time between LOI and close. Again, minimum 30 days is advisable. The longer the better, but you don't want to start and get everything ramped too far in advance either. So, it's You kind of, 30 to 60 days is perfect. Just some best practices is solving directional needs for strategic work streams first. And I touched upon this on the question about the transformation, target operating model, go to market, product roadmap, brand decisions, these things that are kind of the big moves that really require steerco and senior leadership to define. Sometimes they can be contentious, maybe require more data, maybe require some research to figure out. But you got to get them solved at least directionally before you force that work down into, sales and marketing, the product team, et cetera, because they're going to spin on it without that direction. And so kind of, forcing the issue on those and getting those resolved early. It doesn't have to be, every decision made, but you gotta tackle those. The speed bump that we see all the time is delaying target operating model and other strategic decisions. So tying to the first one I meant as a best practice, pushing that down. We don't want to get into that yet because of the earnout. We don't want to get into that yet because it's kind of sensitive. We don't know those folks yet enough. No, you really have to tackle those early because it's gonna affect a lot of downstream work. Key deliverables at that stage, value drivers and objectives. So that's the articulation of the deal thesis, objectives, assumptions, integration complete, the why and the articulation of the levers that deliver the deal thesis, and then what has to get done. And then leadership, where you can help, is helping us drive decision needs for strategic work stream. So making that a priority, leaning in about making some calls on some of these areas early that can positively impact the process. Okay, Grace? Execution, which is close, to around day 90 or 120. Let me clarify. I use day 90 or 120 because that's typically when we're wrapping up. Our philosophy is it's our job to put ourselves out of a job. So we're very focused on, that aperture. And we think speed works to your advantage in kind of the lower end of, lower middle market and maybe lower mid market anyway. So you just want to have a bias for urgency. So that's why we've kind of defined it that way. But best practices is maintaining a weekly rhythm. So your IMO is meeting weekly. You're meeting weekly with the functional work streams to drive the plan. You're meeting with steerco to resolve escalations or decision needs. Keeping that going, not making it ad hoc. We're not meeting this week, or this week it's Wednesday, next week it's Friday. We don't even know when it's going to be the following week. Get it down. It's the same day every week for 90 days. Everyone knows what they're supposed to prepare in advance. The agenda is resolving issues and directional needs. It's not going through work plans and staring and glaring. That's not the purpose of that meeting. You want to take ground every week and show progress. Speed bumps is just underestimating change management needs. So it's good to move fast, but if you are putting a lot of change on folks, and we'll talk about this in a couple of slides, how are you factoring that into your plans? What initiatives need to get birthed to, address change management needs, training, communications, other things. Don't just assume people can pick it up and do it the way you've been doing it without some support. Deliverables is operationalizing the target operating model. Sometimes it takes longer than 90 to or 120 days to do it fully. It may take a while to get the full organization set down to every level. But getting like L1 to L3 done, or as far as you can get, is really important. Leadership plus and minus here, reinforcing IMO versus business as usual discipline. So, sometimes the integration work and kind of just running the business can get conflated a bit. And you want to keep the integration work in a separate lane and don't have scope creep where people are throwing, business things into the integration because, hey, we have a project management office. We have all these people spinning around doing work. What a great way to get my project done and get some resource help, but it has nothing really to do with integration. You want to avoid that because the integration work is enough to do. Okay, Grace. So here's a kind of a linear path that kind of summarizes a few things I've been talking about. And what this is really shows is integration is a progression from mobilizing the people, which is up on the far left, getting the strategy articulated next, getting that articulated down to the functional level, IT, sales and marketing, et cetera. Then the very detailed year one work plans or however long it takes, where you have work streams, initiatives, assignments, status, dates, you're flagging change management or communication needs in the tool, but you're getting all the gory detail incorporated into your project management tool. And then from there, you can identify key milestones. And if you go to the bottom left, you have your integration roadmap where by function, all the key milestones across the life of the integration. So A, are you making progress week to week, knocking down milestones? And B, and sometimes the most elusive thing for people is when are we complete? Well, now you have a plan of record and one source of truth that tells you when every function and when the integration is going to be complete. And then going to the next box there, you're monitoring that weekly. What you see there in that little eye chart is stuff that's automated and spits out from the Smartsheet tool I mentioned earlier, but it shows you where every function and the overall integration is as far as percentage complete, still in progress. It'll mark red, yellows, all that fun stuff. But that's your scorecard, and that's what you're looking at every week to see if you're progressing. Then really important at day 90, we do an exercise where we audit the plan and we go back and look at the value drivers and objectives, go back and look at the functional work plans and just make sure, is there anything in the original deal thesis that we outlined that we had to get done? Now we're looking at all the very detailed work. Do we have any gaps? Are there any things we've discovered that weren't there before that we need to add some work to make sure it gets done? It's a quality assurance audit on your plan of record. And then last, transferring to IMO, I should say PMO, but you're transferring internally. There's always a long tail for an integration, so you can transfer that to internal resource, keep the process up as needed. Maybe you can move to bi-weekly meetings at that point, but you want to run out the long tail, make sure nothing falls down or just doesn't get done because nobody's paying attention to it. This is just an example of governance, and there's no rocket science here. We all know how to do governance, but you want to establish this early. If you need a steer co, you'll have your company, somebody from the target. They don't need to be added right away. Maybe the sponsor in the other column. Your integration office support, like you can see, that's where we typically live. And then your functional groups, which classic 2 in the box model. You want to involve your target co-personnel ahead of close. You have day one planning you need to do. You have communications that you need to prep and make sure is right. That's an entire process. The earlier they are involved, you want to do some work on your side to get some things straight. But plans always get better with target company personnel involvement. And so figuring out the right aperture to bring them in when you've done a little bit of work, kind of sketch the plan, and it still feels collaborative to them is real important. But that governance framework needs to be formalized. When we set these up, we have roles and responsibilities for all this we'll go through so people know exactly what their expectations are, as a designated lead in the integration management office.
Scott, how much access to target personnel do you need to get all the planning deliverables completed by close?
Yeah, it can vary sometimes. I mean, we like to get, value drivers, objectives, and maybe charters stubbed in draft form prior to bringing in the target personnel. That way we're looking at something that maybe we've had some difficult conversations on. But it still feels collaborative, right? They still feel like they're helping, the ink's still wet, and they can affect the plan. But in terms of access, sometimes you might not have all of the leads. There may be people that have not been read in yet, or perhaps there's a personnel decision pending on who that person should be. But typically, we have great luck with, who we do have, and we can get a lot done. And then, if there's a certain function that maybe you just don't have access to that person because of sensitivities or some of the other issues I mentioned, you just make that a priority as soon as you do. Okay. This is just a quick summary of typical scope. And when I say like you want to get things done in that planning window, LOI to close, you can see the deliverables there. So it's a lot of the stuff that you're done. And what we strive to do is get all of that done by close. And why? Because you can pivot to execution. There's always a little bit of work that you have to do after close. Maybe you didn't have access to people, as we just discussed, or some information. But you try to get as much of that done. It just accelerates your value harvesting. When you can pivot to close, pivot to execution after close, and like a lot of times we'll have that roadmap built that we went through. And then you're immediately in execution mode, and you're driving momentum into the acquired entity. You're chalking up wins. You're getting started on things that just help the organizations come together, with a common purpose. We're not planning anymore, we're executing. So I put a little, I don't want to address this too extensively, but we don't assume that what works for somebody in professional service works for somebody in residential and facilities management. So there's always an overlay of things that are more important in one sector than might be in others. And so, how are we thinking that critically in our integration planning? And these are just some examples, but and the point here is, think about things like, in the first one, in that particular sector, what we always find is, you may be rolling up different geographic areas of a business that's kind of does the same thing, but the ways of getting work done in those offices or regions can really vary by location. They can be very independent. And it's just, wow, you thought like you were going to figure out how to homogenize the way they do business with yours. Actually, you got to homogenize the way they do business among themselves a bit, and then yours. And so, but that's a factor that you need to put into your integration planning. That's not going to be the same for other industries. For professional services, one of the things that there's zero margin of error for business as usual disruptions. You have people taking care of clients, they're pitching work, they're delivering work. The integration cannot interrupt that cycle. And so, not that you want customer continuity and business as usual is important anywhere, but professional services especially so. And then there's some things there for just especially distribution. But things that I would say common denominators, almost any sector. Expediency, we talked about that, trying to get most of this done or underway by that day 90 or 120 aperture. Prioritization of the value creation initiatives that I can think of no integration where that's not important. Same with people, addressing the communications. Day one communication needs, if needed, and a significant culture change management considerations. And then how are you tracking, how do you know you're moving the needle? What is your, how are you holding people accountable for not only the functional work plans, but at the program level? And what are you using, in real time in terms of reporting to look in on your integration progress? For some of you, you might have 2 or 3 going on at the same time. One just started, one's in the middle, one's at the end. What kind of dashboards are you looking at to see, where they are? to see what's happening in one that didn't happen in the other. So why? And making those adjustments. I'd like to wrap up quickly on a topic near and dear to my heart, which is calm culture and change. And we have some folks, and we've made a very deliberate effort to make this a core part of our practice. And the communications goes without saying. We do all of the day one communications prep for employees and customers and suppliers. That's kind of a table stakes, if you will. But the other thing is just culture and change, and especially with what I find is it's very advisable just to bring a very pragmatic approach to this. We don't try to boil the ocean when it comes to culture. You can get some unrealistic culture goals about trying to build one unified culture and all that. What you have to do is realize and agree on what culture is, because you ask people and everyone defines it differently. And I put some definitions in there. But that's the first thing, just aligning on, what it is and what it isn't. So we have that understanding first. And then, what are the things that are really important that will kind of speed NewCo coming together and, achievement of business objectives? What are the 2 or 3 things that are really important in terms of where you may be alike that you can build on, or that you may be different, and then you have to, pay attention to in terms of communication, maybe training, and other things, and let the other stuff kind of percolate and come together over time. But prioritization and cultural integration, I think, is one of the most important things. And you can't do it unless you do an assessment, talk to a sampling of people, ask the right questions, and figure out what that is. You can't go on, antiquated perceptions of each other. I find that a lot. We've been competing for years and years, but the perceptions are of an older generation in the company, kind of not the new, and they have to be melded to be accurate. The second is change, and again, that's another thing that you need to define, make sure everyone understands, what is change. And I've listed the things that are the typical suspects there. And then you need your functional leads and your process when we have a work stream or initiatives that require implementation of something new or different. Flag those, and the way we build our Smartsheet tool, as we talked about earlier, enables us to do that, so we can follow up on the change management needs for people that are most affected by it. Just make sure we're not pushing down something new without training, without communication, without maybe performance management adjustments based on something that they're asked to do now that's different than what they did do. There's a lot in change, and so you just need to pay attention and prioritize it. But these are probably the 2 most overlooked, underestimated, underappreciated areas in transformative M&A. Okay, Grace? Yeah, just a little bit here on communications. And this is really for acquired employees. But the challenge is in managing noise, orchestrating delivery, getting all those "what about me" questions answered, consolidating the information from different channels, and getting all this stuff done ahead of day one. And you can see on the right there is the stuff that is our kind of standard menu for day one planning. But you can get a lot of points for making day one flawless and having the questions answered that you're going to get. Prioritizing me questions ahead of, hey, this is the new mission, vision, and values. Those are both important. People won't hear number 2 until you've told them and assuaged concerns about number 1. So you got to tackle those. And by the way, the process of getting those answered so you can distribute it is a great catalyst for solving integration work, because you're going to have to do it anyway. So you're making decisions on things that you're going to do, so you can put it in writing. It just accelerates your integration delivery by nature. Then don't go dark. You can have a big flurry on day one and have a lot of great stuff and a, joint webinar or a town hall, and then, it's crickets afterwards. You want to have regular updates with integration wins, maybe, announcements on org changes or important initiatives, new branding, or follow it up for a while. We say at least till day 90, and then you can kind of assimilate into what your normal employee communication rhythm is. But just keep it up and be consistent. People will be very hungry for news. All
Scott,
right.
how involved is the target in the prep for day one comms?
Yeah, very involved, because one of the things that you have to do is a process called stakeholder mapping, where you need to understand, who are their key stakeholders? How are they talking to them today? Who is delivering those messages? So you're coordinating with those folks to make sure that, all that day one communications that I just went through, that you have that prepped and the logistics for delivery aligns with how they're operating today. You don't have messages and communication going through new channels at a time where it needs to, be seamless. And so that requires coordination with the target.
Another question here. How often does the deal thesis, value creation thesis pivot during the integration process? And what are some typical pivot triggers? Could they have been recognized earlier?
Yeah, I would say, I don't see material changes. What I see is expectations changing on timing more than anything. I think most of the folks that do this work, PE firms or the corp dev executives at corporate acquirers, I mean, they've done their work and understand the levers and deal thesis drivers. When you get into the reality of execution, I think what you find the most time is that maybe you didn't have the enablers, or they weren't in the state that you thought they were to, enable execution on the time frame that you expected. And so I think it's more adjustments on timing than, discounting what you thought you were going to get.
Great. Looking at the Q&A, I think we've wrapped up this session, which is great. The one thing I would say is, as you learn more about M&A and M&A integration, and if you'd like to reach out to us, we are first and foremost folks that like to train up and instruct on this topic. And if you have an integration that's pending, we're happy to spend some time with you one-on-one in individual sessions to talk a little bit more about what your unique circumstance is, and also, where potentially, you could add value with some of the knowledge that we have. So we're happy to do that anytime. So feel free to reach out to me. As noted, I think you've all seen my email, or if not, you will be shortly, regarding connecting. But thank you very much for the time today. It was a good session. We had a lot of people that and you all stuck it out. So really appreciate that. Scott or Grace, do you have any other comments before we wrap it up today?
No, I just wanted to thank everybody for attending. I hope you learned something new today.
Thanks for attending all. We'll be sending out a follow-up email along with the recording.